Welcome to Keith Knight Don't Tread on Anyone in the Libertarian Institute. Here is the case for villainy with regard to Winston Churchill. Starting off with the success of Churchill's starvation blockade. This is according to research done by former Nixon speechwriter Patrick J. Buchanan in his book Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War. The starvation blockade of the First Lord Winston Churchill, writes historian Ralph Rago, was probably the most effective weapon employed on either side of the conflict. About 750,000 German civilians succumbed to hunger and disease caused by malnutrition. That is almost 100 times the number of civilian dead attributed to German atrocities in Belgium. Again, this is the First World War when Winston Churchill is not prime minister, but calling the shots for the Admiralty. According to a very pro-Churchill historian, Martin Gilbert, he provided the estimate that 762,106 total German civilians died as a causal result of Churchill's blockade that he convinced Prime Minister Henry Asquith to go along with. A lot of people might be confused. You might think, well, if a country's blockaded, that must really stimulate the domestic economy and create a lot of jobs. That, of course, is a lie that socialists try to convince us of. Winston Churchill wrote a book, The World Crisis, and in a section regarding 1916 to 1918, page 672, Churchill says, "The British blockade treated the whole of Germany as if it were a beleaguered fortress, and avowedly sought to starve the whole population, men, women, and children, old and young, wounded and sound, into submission." Notice, it's not about, we did everything we could to kill Kaiser Wilhelm and end the war quickly. It was about waging war on the civilian population. This is a war memorandum from 1919. Winston Churchill said, "I am strongly in favor of using poison gas against uncivilized tribes." Well, his definition of uncivil apparently includes first world countries like Germany in the First and Second World War. "The moral effect should be so good that the loss of life should be reduced to a minimum. It is not necessary to use only the most deadly gases. Gases can be used which cause great inconvenience and would spread a lively terror, and yet would leave no serious permanent effects on most of those affected." So we constantly get the term anarchy associated with chaos, yet a great hero of statism is very interested in spreading a lively terror among uncivilized tribes. Research from Pat Buchanan continues. In Advance to Barbarism, to which the Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral wrote the foreword, historian F.J.P. Veal traces Britain's abandonment of the rules of civilized warfare to May 11th, 1940, just 24 hours after the German army invaded France. Bomber Command sent 18 Whiteley bombers on a night run far from the front on Westphalia. Writes Veal, italicizing his words. This raid on the night of May 11th, 1940, although in itself trivial, was an epoch-making event since it was the first deliberate breach of the fundamental rule of civilized warfare that hostilities must only be waged against the enemy combatant forces. It had taken Churchill only 24 hours as prime minister to remove the keystone upholding the whole structure of civilized warfare as it had been gradually built up in Europe during the preceding 2 centuries. From there, that structure of civilized warfare collapsed in ruins. So when Buchanan says he had only been prime minister for 24 hours, Winston Churchill was not elected. Neville Chamberlain was elected as prime minister. There was what's referred to as the Narvel debacle that included mining the seas of Norway. This was a terrible incident, and Chamberlain had to step down. Churchill took his spot. So Churchill was not elected. Stalin was not elected. And those are the people fighting on behalf of democracy. And the third guy, Franklin Roosevelt, had Executive Order 9066, which sent 117,000 Japanese people into internment camps for years. That was who the good guys were in this war, as we're told by Bill Kristol and David Frum. Pat Buchanan goes on. B.H. Littlehart confirms it. When Mr. Churchill came into power, One of the first decisions of his government was to extend bombing to the non combatant area. While the Luftwaffe had bombed cities, Little Hart noted the critical strategic and moral difference with what Britain was doing. Bombing of Warsaw and Rotterdam did not take place until German troops were fighting their way into these cities and thus conformed to the old rules of siege bombardment. In his first meeting with Stalin in 1942, Churchill brought up the Royal Air Force bombing of German cities to ingratiate himself with the tyrant by impressing upon him how ruthless Britain intended to be. Also worth noting, Joseph Stalin had committed far worse crimes than Adolf Hitler at this point in history if you research the Holodomor, which is Stalin's atrocities in Ukraine. Of course, Stalin can commit atrocities which kill millions of Ukrainians, and we can have a formal alliance with him. Vladimir Putin, however, is a bad guy who we can never talk to. Churchill now spoke of the bombing of Germany. This was already considerable, he said, and would increase. Britain looked upon the morale of the German civilian population as a military target. We sought no mercy, and we would show no mercy. Britain hoped to shatter 20 German cities, as several had already been shattered. If need be, as the war went on, we hoped to shatter almost every dwelling in almost every German city. At this point in the conversation, writes Martin Gilbert, the record of the meeting noted, Stalin smiled and said, that would not be bad. And thenceforth, the atmosphere became progressively more cordial. What Churchill had been describing to Stalin was a British policy to dehouse the civilian population of Germany. Who was the instigator and architect of the policy to carpet bomb German cities? Frederick Lindemann, the Prof, is also known as Lord Cherwell, an intimate of Churchill's, whom he had brought into his war cabinet as a science advisor. Lindemann had an almost pathological hatred for National Socialist Germany and an almost medieval desire for revenge. Charles Percy Snow, a science advisor to the war government, wrote that Lindemann had a zealous faith in the efficacy of bombing. Early in 1942, when Britain had failed to achieve a single major victory, Lindemann presented his great paper to the cabinet. Here is Charles Percy Snow, science advisor to the government, explaining what that paper laid out in. This is from a lecture he gave in 1961 titled Science and Government at Harvard University. The paper laid down a strategic policy. The bombing must be directed especially against German working class houses. Middle class houses have too much space round them and are so to waste bombs. The paper claimed that given a total concentration of effort on the production and use of bombing aircraft, it would be possible in all the larger towns of Germany, that is, those with more than 50,000 inhabitants, to destroy 50% of all houses. More insight into Frederick Lindemann and Winston Churchill's dehousing policy was given to us in 1944 by the gentleman J.M. Spate. This was the principal secretary for the Air Ministry. The title is Bombing Vindicated, a Survey of Recent Developments by this leading authority on air warfare. This was in 1944. This was even before Dresden. J.M. Spate says, because we were doubtful about the psychological effect of propagandist distortion of the truth that it was we who started the strategic bombing offensive, we have shrunk from giving our great decision of May 11th, 1940, the publicity which it deserves. It was a splendid decision. It was as heroic, as self-sacrificing as Russia's decision to adopt her policy of scorched earth. Our splendid, heroic, and self-sacrificing decision to bomb cities, insists Spate, gave Britons the right to stand as equals alongside the Red Army. For these preemptive strikes on German cities brought Luftwaffe retaliation on British cities, giving Coventry, Birmingham, Sheffield, Southampton the right to look Kiev and Kharkov and Stalingrad and Sebastopol in the face. Our Soviet allies would have been less critical of our inactivity in 1942 if they had understood what we had done. This British propaganda broadcast charged that the Luftwaffe had been bombing cities by brutally targeting London. Spate believed that British cities might have been spared had Churchill not first resorted to city bombing. There was no certainty, but there was reasonable probability that our capital and our industrial centers would not have been attacked if we had continued to refrain from attacking those of Germany. To achieve the extirpation of National Socialist tyranny, there are no lengths of violence which we will go, Churchill told Parliament on September 21st of 1943. By 1944, he had come back around to the idea of using chemical and biological warfare on civilians. In a secret project, he commissioned the preparation of 5 million anthrax cakes to be dropped onto the pastures of North Germany to poison the cattle and through them the people, as the Glasgow Sunday Herald reported in 2001. The aim of Operation Vegetarian was to wipe out the German beef and dairy herds and then see the bacterium spread to the human population. With people then having no access to antibiotics, this would have caused many thousands, perhaps even millions of German men, women, and children to suffer awful deaths. The anthrax cakes were tested on Girard Island off Wester Ross in Scotland, which was not cleared of contamination until 1990. In July of 1944, the Allies were still attempting a breakout from Normandy. Churchill minuted General Pug Ismay of the Chief Staff's Committee. I want you to think very seriously over the question of poison gas. We should drench the cities of Ruhr and many other cities in Germany in such a way that most of the population would be requiring constant medical attention. If we do it, let us do it 100%. In the meantime, I want the matter studied in cold blood by sensible people and not by the particular set of smoldering, uninformed defeatists. I shall, of course, have to square Uncle Joe and the president. It is absurd to consider morality on this topic, Churchill told his RAF planners, that is the Royal Air Force. On the 15th anniversary of the destruction of Dresden, the Washington Post's Ken Riegel wrote, "If any one person can be blamed for the tragedy at Dresden, it appears to have been Winston Churchill." Before leaving for Yalta, Churchill ordered Operation Thunderclap, massive airstrikes to dehouse German civilians to turn them into refugees to clog the roads over which German soldiers had to move to stop a Red Army offensive. Air Marshal Arthur Bomber Harris put Dresden on the targeted list. On the first night of the raid, 770 Lancasters arrived over Dresden around 10 p.m. Remember, this is all sold to us as the free market is really exploitative and it really hurts people in vulnerable situations. Therefore, you need a state led by a great man like Winston Churchill. Of course, they claim that offering someone a job or a product or a service is evil exploitation and must be regulated. But these are the heroes of statism and socialism. In two waves, 3 hours apart, 650,000 incendiary bombs rained down on Dresden's narrow streets and Baroque buildings together with another 1,474 tons of high explosives. The fires burned for 7 days. More than 1,600 acres of the city were devastated, compared to 100 acres burned in the German raid on Coventry. And melting streets burned the shoes off those attempting to flee. Cars, untouched by the fire, burst into flames just from the heat. Thousands sought refuge in cellars where they had died, robbed of oxygen by the flames before the buildings above them collapsed. Novelist Kurt Vonnegut, who was one of 26,000 Allied prisoners of the war in Dresden, helped clean up after the attack, remembers tunneling into the ruins to find the dead sitting upright in what he would describe as Slaughterhouse 5 as corpse mines. Floating in the static water tanks were boiled bodies of hundreds more. Be very wary of capitalism and the free market and voluntary exchanges, but constantly advocate government supremacy. If you were to say to someone, there are a lot of benefits to white supremacy, where whites have more rights than everyone else, They would, of course, call you crazy. However, progressives, right wing socialists, they will all say things like, it's good that we have state supremacy. The state has the right to tax, the right to conscript, the right to declare war. No one else has these rights. The state has them. They can put you in jail. If you resist, they can shoot you. You have no right to go around arresting them. They advocate government supremacy in the face of all these atrocities, and they do it with a straight face. According to a book, The Complete War Memoirs of Charles de Gaulle. Basically, in May of 1940, the National Socialists responded to France and Britain's declaration of war by taking over France and installing the Vichy government. The opposition government in France, allied with Winston Churchill, was led by Charles de Gaulle. Here are his war memoirs. On page 104, de Gaulle says, among the many people in their desire to emerge from an utmost unbearable tension, went so far as to say out loud that they wished the enemy would risk the attack. Foremost among them, Mr. Churchill found the waiting hard to bear. I can still see him at Chicours one August day. Raising his fist toward the sky, he cried, so they won't come? Are you in such a hurry, I told him, to see your town smashed to bits? You see, he replied, the bombing of Oxford, Coventry, Canterbury will cause such a wave of indignation in the United States that they'll come into the war. Churchill not only supported bombing German civilians, he supported the bombing of British civilians. On July 3rd of 1940, Churchill authorized the what's referred to as Operation Catapult. If you look at the International Churchill Society, it's called the Battle of Mers el Kebir, Kebir. This was a British naval attack on French Navy ships at the naval base at Mers el Kebir near Oran, off the coast of French Algeria. This resulted, the British bombardment of the base killed 1,297 French servicemen. Of course, if the National Socialists did that, we'd hear about it nonstop. Churchill does it, and he gets statues all over London. Pat Buchanan's research continues with regard to Dresden. The morning after the Lancaster struck, 500 B-17s arrived over Dresden in two waves with 300 fighter escorts to strafe fleeing survivors. Estimates of the dead in the firestorm range from 35,000 to 250,000. The Associated Press reported, Allied war chiefs have made the long-awaited decision to adopt deliberate terror bombing of German-populated centers as a ruthless expedient to hasten Hitler's doom. In a memo to his air chiefs, Churchill acknowledged what Dresden had been about. It seems to me that the moment has come when the question of bombing German cities simply for the sake of increasing the terror, though under other pretexts, should be reviewed. Sensing they were about to be scapegoated for the actions of Churchill himself ordered, the air chiefs returned to this memo. In 1947, the memoir of Air Marshal Harris, titled Bomber Offensive, implies Churchill gave the order to incinerate Dresden. I will only say that the attack on Dresden was at the time considered a military necessity by much more important people than myself. This guy's the head of the Royal Air Force. It most likely was Winston Churchill. People think that they are so high and mighty and virtuous when they say, I'm against Hamas's crimes on October 7th that killed 1,000 people who were innocent. Good. I really appreciate you being against murdering innocent people. How about murdering 25,000 innocent people who had nothing to do with calling the shots of the National Socialist crimes in Poland or the Eastern Front? Writes A.J.P. Taylor of his countrymen at war. What mattered was the outlook, the readiness by the British of all people to stop at nothing when waging war. Civilized restraints, all considerations of morality were abandoned. By the end of the war, men were ready to kill countless women and children. This was the legacy of the bombing strategy which the British adopted with such high-minded motives. Some of the most extensive research on Frederick Lindemann and Winston Churchill's dehousing policy was brought forth by Max Hastings in his book Bomber Command. He discusses a March 1942 memoir by Lord Cherwell, who is Frederick Lindemann. He said, The following, Sherwill wrote to the Prime Minister on March 30th, 1942, seems a simple method of estimating what we could do by bombing Germany. Again, notice it's not how do we take out Adolf Hitler, Hermann Goring, Rudolf Hess, and Joseph Goebbels. It's all about targeting the civilian population. Careful analysis of the effects of raids on Birmingham, Hull, and elsewhere have shown that, on average, 1 ton of bombs dropped on a built up area demolishes 20 to 40 dwellings and turns 1 to 200 people out of a house and home. We know from our experience that we can count on nearly 14 operational sorties per bomb produced. The average lift of the bombers we are going to produce over the next 15 months will be about 3 tons. It follows that each of these bombers will, in its lifetime, drop about 40 tons of bombs. If these are dropped on built up areas, it will make 4 to 8,000 people homeless. Investigation seems to show that having one's house demolished is most damaging to morale. People seem to mind it more than having their friends or even relatives killed. On the above figures, we should be able to do 10 times as much harm to each of the 58 principal German towns. There seems little doubt that this would break the spirit of the people, but they did it anyways. Buchanan goes on to say, Americans too played a role in adopting methods of barbarism from which earlier generations would have recoiled in horror and disgust. During World War I, we condemned British starvation's blockade before we went in, but supported it with our warships after we went in. This would have been Woodrow Wilson declaring war April 2nd of 1917, 2 years after the Lusitania was attacked, an armed belligerent ship off the coast of Ireland, and a year after he was reelected, running on the campaign promise of he kept us out of war. If Churchill initiated terror bombing, America perfected it. Of course, he means the American regime. A microscopic number of Americans in the population at large were involved in this decision. Boasted Curtis LeMay of his famous raid on Tokyo. We scorched and boiled and baked to death more people in Tokyo that night of March 9th, 10th than went up in vapor in Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. We and the British fought for moral ends. We did not always use moral means by any Christian definition, and Churchill played the lead role in Western man's reversion to barbarism. That operation is titled Operation Meeting House of Tokyo, March 9th and 10th of 1945. Robert McNamara, at the time, he became Secretary of Defense in the 60s during the Cuban Missile Crisis and the invasion of Vietnam. He was collecting statistics at the time under Curtis LeMay. And here's what Robert McNamara said in a documentary titled The Fog of War. Proportionality should be a guideline in war. Killing 50% to 90% of the people of 67 Japanese cities and then bombing them with 2 nuclear bombs is not proportional, in the minds of some people, to the objectives we were trying to achieve. LeMay recognized that what he was doing would have been thought immoral if his side had lost. But what makes it immoral if you lose, and not immoral if you win? It's worth mentioning the Japanese Empire had basically colonized Vietnam in September of 1940 and had been colonizing Korea as early as 1910. So, with the destruction of the Japanese Empire, the U.S. later fought wars in Vietnam and Korea. They inherited the wars of the empire they took down. There were not only benefits from taking down Emperor Hirohito. Pat Buchanan continues. Even had Churchill come west after crushing Stalin's Soviet Union, how could it have been worse for the Jews or the Gypsies or the Slavs or the Christians, tens of millions of whom would die, and 100 million of whom would end up slaves in an empire that was the most brutal and barbaric enemy Christianity had ever known? Had Britain not given the war guarantee and not declared war over Poland, Western Europe might have avoided war altogether. And was the war worth it? Let us give the last word to Churchill. 3 years after the victory, he wrote The Gathering Storm, saying, The human tragedy reaches its climax in the fact that after all the exertions and sacrifices of hundreds of millions of people and the victories of the righteous cause, we have still not found peace or security, and we lie in the grip of even worse perils than those we have surmounted. What did Churchill mean by even worse perils than National Socialism and Adolf Hitler? He meant Stalinism and Stalin, a mass murderer whose victims exceeded even those of Hitler. By 1948, all of Stalin's promises about elections had been broken, and he was crushing all opposition to communist tyranny in the 11 countries now in his grip, including Czechoslovakia, for which Churchill had wanted to go to war, and Poland, for which Churchill had demanded Britain go to war. The case of Czechoslovakia. This is in regard to what's referred to as the Munich Agreement. A lot of people say, well, Neville Chamberlain let the Sudetenland, 1/5 of Czechoslovakia, get invaded by the Germans, even though basically they were all Germans. It was a part of Germany stripped away after the First World War. Uh, Neville Chamberlain should have declared war for violating 1/5 of Czechoslovakia. Well, after the war, all of Czechoslovakia was under the grip and occupation of the Bolshevik regime. If the West faced even worse perils in 1948 than in 1939, what had it all been for? Yes, Hitler was dead and National Socialism exterminated, but at a cost of 50 million lives, and Britain had lost 400,000 men and was broken and bankrupt. To British statesmen, maintaining a balance of power was dogma. Here, Buchanan gets into the rationale behind British entry into the First and Second World War. In 1938, Lord Londonderry, back from a meeting with Hitler, wrote Churchill, "I should like to get out of your mind what appears to be a strong anti-German obsession." Churchill replied that Londonderry was mistaken in supposing that I have an anti-German obsession. He went on to explain, British policy for 400 years has been to oppose the strongest power in Europe by weaving together a combination of other countries strong enough to face the bully. Sometimes it is Spain, sometimes the French monarchy, sometimes the French Empire, sometimes Germany. I have no doubt about who it is now. But if France set up to claim the overlordship of Europe, I shall equally endeavor to oppose them. It is thus, through the centuries, we have kept our liberties, maintained our life and power. So this had nothing to do with, we saw the crimes of Adolf Hitler, we weighed the costs and benefits, and we did everything to take out his regime. It wasn't against his regime, it was against the German civilian population. And regardless of the actions of the National Socialists, they would have gone to war because they saw Germany as a big competitor on the continent who they didn't want to compete against. Like every state, they want to be a monopolist on violence. Just as Washington, D.C. would never allow Texas to get so big and so powerful that Texas could secede without, of course, starting a civil war, the British viewed all of Europe as that way. Twice this policy would bring Britain into war with Germany, until by 1945, Britain was too weak to play the role any longer. She would lose her empire because of what Lord Salisbury had said in 1877 was the commonest error in politics, sticking to the carcass of dead policies. Why did Britain declare war on Germany twice? As we shall see, neither Kaiser nor Hitler sought to destroy Britain or her empire. Both admired what Britain had built. Both sought an alliance with England. The Kaiser was the eldest son of Queen Victoria. Thus, the crucial question, were these two devastating wars Britain declared on Germany wars of necessity or wars of choice? I want to look at the text of the declarations of war. First by Henry Asquith, Prime Minister of England. This would have been in 1914. Asquith says, August 5th, 1914, he told the House of Commons, our ambassador at Berlin received his passports at 7 o'clock last evening, and since 11 o'clock last night, a state of war has existed between Germany and ourselves. We have received from our minister at Brussels the following telegram. I have just received from Minister for Foreign Affairs, that is the Belgian Minister of Foreign Affairs, a note which the following is a little translation. Belgian government regret to have to inform His Majesty's government that this morning armed forces of Germany penetrated into Belgium territory in violation of engagements assumed by treaty. That is in reference to a treaty from 1839 where England said if anyone violates the independence of Belgium, England has the right to declare war on these people. So the British government from 100 years ago made a promise for future generations that they would have to die and get conscripted or enslaved to fight a war against the Germans. Here is the wording of Neville Chamberlain's declaration of war in 1939. Again, this is the guy who we're told is a dumb peace dove who never did anything. This is the guy who declared war. Chamberlain says on September 3rd, 1939, 2 days after the National Socialist reunification of Danzig, a town that was 95% German. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently, this country is at war with Germany. One of the major lessons is that it does not make you some kind, virtuous person to put obligations on other human beings to go to war for other countries to determine who sits on the throne of those countries. So you are not some virtuous, kind person when you say, hell yeah, I think America and Ukraine should go to war against Russia to determine who gets to call the shots on the Donbass, on Donetsk and Luhansk. Yeah, I think billions potentially could die with a nuclear exchange with regard to China. This way, we can make sure that Taiwan has this politician on the throne and not a politician who's sympathetic to China. They say it's because we might lose access to computer chips. We already trade hundreds of billions of dollars with China every year. We would just keep trading, even if they did. And of course, the blatant contradiction. Israel can have a 20-year blockade on Gaza, but if China so much as threatens a blockade, well, then the nukes have to come out. Buchanan goes on. Yet in his memoir, David Lloyd George, who led Britain to victory in World War I, wrote, "We all blundered into war." In his memoirs, Churchill, who led Britain to victory in World War II, wrote, "One day President Roosevelt told me that he was asking publicly for suggestions about what the war should be called. I said at once, the unnecessary war. There was never a war more easy to stop than that which has just wrecked what was left of the world from the previous struggle." The Soviet Union, while Russia lost millions of soldiers and civilians and suffered devastation, Stalin emerged from the war as the most powerful czar in history, with the Red Army occupying Berlin, Vienna, and Prague. In the aftermath, communist parties loyal to Stalin would vie for powers in Paris and Rome, and communist revolutionaries would help tear down the empires of the West. In 1949, Stalin would tremble the subjects of the peoples of communism as China fell to the armies of Mao Zedong, converting America's wartime ally into Stalin's partner in world conquest. In 1949, too, Stalin's scientists, with stolen American technology, exploded an atomic bomb. For almost all the other nations and peoples of Europe, the war would prove more a disaster than triumph. The case of Britain, Buchanan summarizes, from Norway to France to Greece to Crete and Libya, Britain lost every battle with the Germans until El Amiens in 1942. She would end the war with 400,000 dead and a Pyrrhic victory and never again be great. Churchill had devoted his life to three causes: the preservation of the empire, keeping socialism at bay, and preventing any hostile power from dominating Europe. By July of 1945, all three had been lost and Churchill dismissed by the people he had led to victory. I'd like to end with one of my favorite quotes. This is from the Libertarian Party of New Hampshire. "There's still people out there calling John McCain a great man and a hero. No. Sorry, Meghan McCain. We understand he's your father and all, but that blood-soaked monster didn't see a country on the map he didn't want to invade. Wars don't make great men. Great men prevent wars. Thank you so much to Martyrmaid and Tucker Carlson for making this a topic people can freely discuss. Thanks to everyone for watching. Keith Knight, don't tread on anyone.